Welcome everyone to our part two in terms of the joy of sampling. I like to call it the joy of sampling because usually sampling has some sort of messy or complicated stigmas around it. But I think we can all agree here, everyone on this panel and pretty much everyone in attendance, that hip hop is a part of our life. And if hip hop is a part of our life, then it's important to know what are the elements and how does it come together and how is it made? My name is Barry Cole. I'm a music supervisor. I love licensing music so that we can pay artists so that they can create more art. When I first learned what sampling was about and learned about how samples get cleared and how I think the big shift for me was watching Puff Daddy, P. Diddy years ago. It's like, wait a minute, this guy is sampling the biggest songs in the world. He must be paying at least half, of what he's making to these people. And then I realized that kind of often said thing, would you rather have 50% of something that sells 1 million copies or 100% of something that sells 100 copies? And it started to make me realize that there's such value in the creativity that our producers and that our artists use to put together and architect this great music that has all meant so much to us. So I want to thank the Guild and thank ABCO for sponsoring the panel. And I would love for our great and illustrious panelists to introduce themselves a little bit because they each play a crucial role in the architecture of this music that we call hip hop. You start with you, Cheapshot.
Yeah, hi, I'm Cheapshot. I'm a co-founder of a company called the Math Club. I was a DJ hip hop producer for 25 years before I started this company. And kind of like I was sample based and I was part of that, the process of, I was doing it while everyone was sort of figuring it out and got into a lot of trouble along the way with sampling experience. And, but I loved the music and I found my home in film and television. And obviously when I made that transition, I had to figure out how to not do it or how to do it smarter and legal. And most recently, my mission has been to get the legends themselves involved in the creative process, because a lot of it has been, early on in my career, it was, hey, can you replace the Naughty by Nature song? Hey, can you replace the, Tribe Called Quest song? But, I figured these guys laid the bricks for this business and a lot of them are all but forgotten. So if I could do my part in including them and making them reap the benefits of what they contributed, then my life would be complete. So that's who I am and what I do.
That's amazing. We're going to come back to Cheapshot so we can talk about when you are creating new 90s hip hop. Like, how does that happen? Because there's only a finite amount of music from that time period. But as Cheapshot said, the artists are still around. A lot of the producers are still around. Adam, can we get an introduction from you?
Sure. My name is Adam Weitz. I head up TV, film, trailer, and sample licensing at APM Music. Been around for about 35 years. We're actually joint venture between Sony Music Publishing and Universal Music Publishing. We have about 1 million tracks, and many of which date back to the 20th century. And I started collecting these records when I was a teenager in order to sample them. So it's kind of ironic that I'm now able to clear these samples. So I came up through hip hop. I had the honor of working with MF Doom back all the way in 2001. I'm also an attorney, and I wound up in LA scoring Saturday morning cartoons. Wow. So kind of a weird path. And finally, when I got into sync, it enabled me to use my music side of the brain and my legal side of the brain and licensing. So here I am, and I'm really thrilled to be able to have a very pro sampling, pro producer perspective on this. As Deborah can probably tell you, we almost never say no. And, just want everyone to know that APM's catalog and we have about 40,000 archival tracks. We're open for business for sampling. We want to invite people to sample our catalog and am, have a unique sort of perspective on that stuff. So that's it.
Thanks so much. Adam represents a very important part of the anatomy as well. Where do you seek material that can be cleared? Where can you actually get somebody on the phone and learn how this happens so that you can have a good experience, so that you can do it another way? Deborah Mannis-Gardner, please. I would love to spend like an hour introducing you. We all owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to this woman, because without her, a lot of the samples that we hear on radio and film and television for not just like the past 5 years or 10 years, but for the periods of hip hop. This woman has been at eye level, working with the artists, working with both sides, and thank you. So can you give us a little bit of an introduction of yourself and how you came about sample clearance?
Sure. I'm Deborah Mannis-Gardner. I'm DMG Clearances. I started doing clearances back in 1990 for a company called Diamond Time that's not even around anymore. Then went in-house at RCA Records, hated it, and decided to go out on my own. And January 1st, 1996, opened the doors of DMG Clearances, starting as a one-woman business. We've been around, I think it's our 25th year, according to LinkedIn this year. And as of March 1st, there will be 12 people under our umbrella of handling music clearances, from samples, movie, TV, new technology, video games, all that stuff. But my love is sample clearances. For me, to clear a sample is as soothing as meditation. If I'm having a really horrible day, I'll sit down and clear a sample, and then everything is good. So it's something that I cherish and love, and try to work with people to come to an understanding. You always have to remember, not everything is available for sampling. Music is something very personal. And so you always have to respect that. I love the creativity of the producers. I was sitting in Barry's other panel prior to this, where you see these amazing people, how they create. But we always have to remember on the receiving end, do they want to be sampled? The song that they created, do they want elements taken out and put into something else? But sampling is such an amazing skill and talent.
Thank you so much. And with Deborah, we really have how the nuts and bolts of sampling come together, because every sample isn't dealt with the same way. Sometimes you're sampling a recording or a master recording. Sometimes if you're sampling a master, there's generally a copyright attached to it. But sometimes you're just covering or interpolating a melody or a part of the copyright, so that the sample clearance approach is a little bit different. What I wanted to do was do a dry run of us talking about creating a track from scratch, really quickly, just so that we can go through the different stages and the different stops where the creativity is, when it's time to look for resources, and then when it's time to call someone like Deborah. So Cheapshot, let's say I'm working on a film, and the director really, really wants a Public Enemy track. And they're like, it's something about the feel and the production and all that, whatever it is, that says everything that I want to say in this scene. So go get me Public Enemy. And of course, as the music supervisor, I'm like, that's great. We don't necessarily have Public Enemy money, but let me do some research. And in my research, I find out that Chuck D, in all of his wisdom, had the wherewithal to re-record a lot of his music, so that he could actually do licensing transactions for film and TV. Now, they're not the original recording that you may have heard 1,000 times over, but they're pretty close. So if I go to a director and say, hey, well, I can't get you the original for our budget, but I can get the re-record, and the director says, yeah, I'm still not feeling it. Is there anything else we can pursue? I might enlist the help of someone like the Math Club. Because from what I know about the Math Club have a track record of working with classic legendary artists, but doing new production, so that music is ultimately clearable for film and television. So Cheapshot, if I came to you and said, I'm working on this film, the director wants this Public Enemy track, but he's not into the re-record, do you have any ideas? How do you approach that?
Great question. The way we would approach it is, because we have, like, because I'm a producer from the era, I know the tricks of how it was actually made. In terms of like, just this, the energy and the wherewithal of the technology that was available and what it's supposed to sound like in terms of mix and process. And then it's sometimes it's a journey to go locate the person. But we have, feet on the ground in New York. We got people out here, and just through our connections, we were pretty good at getting most MCs of the 90s. And then it's about injecting the same energy and tone, right? Obviously, you can't mention Twitter or Instagram in the rap. You got to keep it within the time period, and you got to inject it with the energy. And what we found also is, we're all getting a little bit older, and sometimes these guys' voices start to change, and they haven't done it in a while. So like riding a bike, because sometimes you got to just get them right back in the mind frame of what they were, of who they were, and bring out the essence of what they are and how they contributed to the culture. And we put our best foot forward. We try to make them timeless tracks that don't, that you can't tell what era they're from, right? So using technology along with production, like vocal production, we can typically get there.
You hit on something really important as well, because you said because you were a producer from that time, the tools and the production techniques that would be needed to turn a song or create a song that has a 90s hip hop feel to it. So the amazing thing to me is that means that it's not necessarily dependent on that record that everybody else has sampled, or that one that's been in somebody else's song. So what if, the directors come to me, but the producer's like, look, we're really low on money, but we really need this Public Enemy song. It has to be sample free unless you can find material that you can actually sample and make like a reasonable deal with, so that we can get this going. And that kind of transitions me over to Adam in APM, where a producer might go to actually look for inspiration. I know there's a song that I'm a big Stone Throw Records fan, big Peanut Butter Wolf fan, and Peanut Butter Wolf put out an album called My Uzi Weighs a Ton. No, my Vinyl Weighs a Ton. And the first song was called Area. It was a song with Planet Asia, and that song still goes through my head. And I remember doing the research and trying to figure out what was the sample, and I was surprised to find out it was from a KPM library. And that was one of the first times I realized, wow, it's not just about digging in these old funk crates. It's like there's music everywhere. Adam, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, one of the special things about library music for sampling is that, these libraries use the best session musicians in the world. And so there are these, 1 degree separations of some of your greatest sample uses in history and folks that contributed to our catalog. So for example, we have an album by Herbie Flowers, who is a session bass player in the UK. He happened to be Bowie's bass player, and Bowie hired him to do the bass line on Lou Reed's Walk on the Wild Side. And, by extension, Can I Kick It? That guy was recording albums for KPM at the time. Probably one of the most sampled songs in the history of sampling, Champ by the Mohawks. That song was recorded at a KPM recording session by Alan Hawkshaw. We have the remainder of that session in our catalog. They just took that one out because it was the hit. There are rumors that I haven't been able to prove yet that Jimmy Page played on a bunch of KPM stuff. So looking into it, we know Ron Giesen, Pink Floyd collaborator, London Symphony Orchestra, just a ton of Sid Dale, Brian Bennett, great, incredible talent playing on these records. So we know that, one of the appeals of library music is that it was very well recorded, very well produced, and they're rare. They're very rare records. They were done in limited editions to be licensed into TV and film and radio. So, that's why they're called library records, because they were literally loaned out to editors and producers, and they would use it and then bring them back. So they were never commercially released, and they're hard to find. So as a sample source, it's really unique because they're also relatively unheard. They're in the background of TV shows, and most people aren't familiar with it other than a few major ones like the Monday Night Football theme and People's Court, stuff like that. But generally they're unheard, and it also takes some skill to find them. Like these records, I brought one as a prop, but these like KPM records, you don't know what's on this. You can't tell from the cover what's on it. So you have to really familiarize yourself with the producers and the artists behind them. Because in my journey, I bought a lot of duds. And so you wind up finding the folks that you really like. And even still, the archival library records are generally unmined. There are so many of them that have not yet been discovered. And just a couple of weeks ago, we found out that this French library called Patchwork, there are about 30, 40 of those albums, like we have the rights to them, which I didn't know until recently. And that's one of the first albums I ever bought to sample. So for me, it's super awesome. And I think the other appeal of library music for sampling is that it's easy to clear. There are no labels, there are no publishers, there are no artist managers. It's non-union, and we control 100% of the rights. So when I talk to Deborah, we really don't need any other approvals. And when we talk to a composer about it, it's usually out of respect and not because of a legal reason, for approval. So I have some examples, if you'd like me to share, of kind of our music and how it's been sampled over the years.
Why don't we wait till the next question for that? Because I want to flow this song, because I'm supervising this track and director's waiting for this Public Enemy track. I've managed to get in touch with Chuck D, and then Cheapshot's like, no, I got you on the production. Like, just let me know what kind of film. Let me know Chuck will show up. And I'm like, great. We don't have a lot of money. And Cheapshot's like, APM's got a bunch of stuff. It's easy clear. We only have a couple of days. It's like we have 3 days to make this whole thing work. So what's attainable that we can clear in 3 days and still get this production made? And me as a supervisor, I'm chatting all this up to the producer and the director, and the producer is sitting there looking at me. He's like, you're going to create a hip hop track in 3 days with a sample, and it's going to be cleared. I don't believe you. And that's when I've had the wherewithal to make sure that there's a little something extra in the budget for Deborah to come in, so that Deborah can assure the director and the producer from top to bottom that the anatomy of this track is something that can reasonably be put together in 3 days and will be free and clear to be able to utilize it for our film. So Deborah, when you're looking at a new song like that, what are the different categories that you break them down into?
Well, we get this a lot where people, it's the year 2021. So a lot of times we need to clear stuff in 1 day, 1 hour, 1 week. Poor Adam's been on the receiving end. And then there are other times when I work on an album where at least I'm given a couple of weeks or a month. So the first thing we do is, if we know it's something coming from Adam from APM, I'm able to say, this should be able to clear in 24 to 48 hours. And I'll hit up Adam saying, are there any obstacles or do we have any concerns or anything like that? Because I always say with clearances, your first obstacle is availability and then cost. And so those are the two obstacles that you're dealing with. So once you overcome availability and it's available for it to be cleared, and Adam's like, sure, no problem, then it's a matter of Adam and I discussing and negotiating a fee. When I'm clearing samples, budgets are not necessarily in play, because my job is to make sure that the value of the quote equals the value of the sample and not necessarily who's using it. So if I'm clearing something for Marshall or I'm clearing something for an up and coming artist, I try to make sure that that sample quote, that value, mirrors the actual use of the sample. I think that's really important, and I stand firm on that one.
How do you do that? Like, when you say Marshall, I'm assuming you're meaning Eminem?
Oh yeah, sorry, Eminem, yeah. I don't think I've ever called him Eminem on the phone. It's always been Marshall, so yeah. So when we're dealing with this stuff, and if someone's only using a vocal snippet and maybe it only appears a few times, we try to keep that value low. We also know with a lot of the publishing companies, that there's a floor. Most of the major publishers won't go below, 5 or 10%. But I did actually just do a clearance the other day because it was one line used one time and the publisher was kind enough to only quote 2%. On the master side, it's the same thing. There's usually a floor. The major record companies rarely go below 1.5% of PPD. And then, of course, we're talking about the fees. What's also nice when you're dealing with, Barry, you're doing a film or TV show, so these sync rates are required. Sync rates are usually not included in a sample deal. I don't know how many times I got to remind my clients that. That's a secondary clearance. So the only rates you're getting are all audio configuration. And even when I say promo music video, there's got to be reciprocal documentation between the labels and the publishers for that. And then third party, which is usually the streaming, digital downloads, and ringtones. If there's a use for film or TV, we need to go back. But what we try to do is establish that percentage. The publishing percentage is established. So if Adam says, you know what, Deborah, we want 20% for the use of the sample. When it goes to sync, that value is now deemed 20% of that whole value for the sync fee. On the master side, we try to do the same thing. We try to establish that percentage of third-party licensing.
That's amazing. And just to dispel a myth that I've heard, or maybe not heard, and maybe it applies in a different way, there will be a percentage for the publishing, and sometimes on the master side, there's a flat fee. Or is it true that it is always a percentage?
Well, it's a percentage of that flat fee. So, you're right. I mean, and Adam, if you want to join in on this one. So usually they'll say, we want X% of third-party licensing. Here's where the negotiations come in, where it's X% of artist net receipts or X% of, there's Adam, go ahead.
Gross. Yeah. I mean, the first thing is, as a licensor, we know that sampling increases the value of the underlying work, especially for our catalog. So we go into it with that mindset. We know this is good for us. And so we're evaluating how unique is the sample melodically, instrumentally, sonically, how much of it is used in the new track, how extensive is the use, how important is it to the new track? And, I know Deborah doesn't like this, but we do consider who the artist is and what is the potential for sync and ancillary revenue. And then ultimately to what extent will the sample enhance or diminish the value of our copyright and recording, right? So we're kind of taking in all of these factors. We kind of mix it up in a blender, and then I call Deborah and we have a friendly argument, and then we find a happy balance. But really what we're ultimately, I think the formula is that we're getting, it's important to note that in most cases, the label, we're kind of handing over the master. The new master, is going to be quarterbacked by the label, and we retain our share of the publishing that we can license directly for sync. And we typically get a non-recoupable fee for the publishing, and the label will have a recoupable advance for the master side. And that's what Deborah's saying, whether or not that is recouped from the net or the gross, and the creative accounting that sometimes happens there could be a factor. But that's kind of all the ingredients that go into how we're negotiating that.
That's great. That's a lot of information to take in terms of talking about, if we were talking about the complexities of sampling, I feel like we kind of honed in on what those complexities kind of are. But at the same time, we've been talking for maybe 10, 12 minutes. So these concepts they're not rocket science, or, they're not things that change all of the time, but what changes is the artist, changes the production, their management team, the labels, the resources from which we're licensing from. And then the reason why Deborah is so valuable to film, TV, and all media is because she has a familiarity with what the deals have been. So she's a really good barometer for what can be fair or what might be expected, if you're just trying to really gauge what you're getting into by getting into a sample. Wow. So, all right, we've got this track, and Chuck showed up, and Cheapshot was in the studio, and he's like, "All right, I got the sample from Adam." And in my mind, I'm like, "Well, I had Deborah talk to the producer, so they were cool with it. So go to work. Let's put this whole thing together and make sure it flies." What gear are you using, Cheapshot? Like, what's your go-to when you've got this sample and you're like, "All right, we're going in to make this Public Enemy track"?
I mean, we have MPCs and SP1200s, but it's not even what we found is more importantly is the mixing techniques, because they're so different today for modern music than they were in the 90s, right? Like, it was a totally different studio that you'd record in with different mixing gear and hardware and all that stuff. So we just, it's really about emulating and using, what as close to what was readily available in the 90s, as opposed to, over mastering a track or smashing it all together like we do today. So as much as I want to push the buttons on my MPC all the time, Ableton has made it so easy to manipulate audio in a real way that it's hard not to use it, because it's so great and so, perfect.
And do you ever, as a producer, like say, "Oh, well, this is just a snare drum from this song and nobody's really going to know what that is, so I'm just going to put that into the mix"?
There sometimes are layers, there's sometimes layers involved, but there's also like great resources. Like, there's a drummer in New York named J Zone, and there's a lot of people that are sort of redoing a lot of the breaks from the classics, and making them sound close. They mic up their gear to make it sound authentic, and we're free and clear to use those. And obviously, as you know, like Splice has been an amazing resource as that's emerging to the forefront. And we kind of just put that all together. But what's more important is just knowing the ins and outs of how it's made, right? And trying to stay as close to true as possible, and making the effort, because early on, before I got in touch with these guys, we would get asked to replace, the classics. And if you get an unknown young MC, they're not the rapper young MC, but a younger MC of the new era, like, it doesn't sound authentic. They don't know the cadences and the rhyming patterns that were used back then, right? And so we couldn't do it. We would get rejected all the time, no matter how great the track was. If the MC's not right, the voice is just as important as the music. And so in our experience, that's why I went out and started getting in touch with all the guys, because then now we can use the same tools and production techniques, but including the voice on top of it, which becomes now a perfect circle of authenticity. You know what I'm saying?
Wow. I mean, and you said the word authenticity and authentic, and if I'm the music supervisor and my responsibility is to find a 90s hip hop track that we can afford with, the maybe challenge budget we might have, then that authenticity is going to be of the utmost importance for me. Adam, you mentioned that you had something that you wanted to share in terms of the flow or the workflow of samples with APM.
Sure, yeah. A few years ago, KPM created this video that just kind of shows how the archival KPM catalog is really kind of making its way into current music. So I just kind of show a few examples of some of that.
Welcome to a crystal clear world of recorded music created especially for you, the film, television and radio producer. We invite you to listen to a sound sampling of selections taken from this new and ever-expanding giant library of recordings designed for your current productions. Whether your subject matter be past or present, light or serious, drama or documentary.
In the new Toronto wanna be me a little. All your exes know I like my O's with a V in the middle. You will love it.
On born days, I used to blow out the candles, and every Saturday watch cartoons till noon, and then I switched to Ralph and Danny's. I was making up a miracle flows. I care if hands on. What's the beef? The coolie high, cold chiefs, high post techniques, I drape off poetic hands. Up in this bitch, I'm platinum in this bitch, I'm rapping in this bitch, running the game, yeah, I've been lapping in this bitch, you know it's alright. Fuck around and they all might look at a brother different.
Keep that champagne and Bombay to cold. Keep that champagne and Bombay to cold. Pull up, you know, as fast cars we drive.
Yo, they call me William H. The all-time great. I fuck the most hoes out of New York State. I rock my jewels. I'm not a fool. And the small on my back, I got this big ass tool. When I'm skating through the city.
Stop it there.
That's awesome. That's a really good cross section. I love the before and after. Wow.
I mean, like Deborah was saying, it's amazing to me that these records, like a couple of years ago, we got an inbound request from Dr. Dre on a Bruton record, and it almost brought tears to my eyes that he is still digging through vinyl and obscure vinyl for samples. And, you know, it's sort of, that's his thing, like that's his rosebud, you know, that he is looking at obscure production music albums for samples. Like it's, to me, it's just, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing. And Deborah, I was going to ask you, like, what is the sampling horror story? What's the worst case scenario? But you already combated that by saying that when you're stressed, sample clearance is a meditation for you. So there's a level of peace that you've been able to achieve by mastering the administrative details of being able to put different pieces of music together to create a new thing. So is there anything in sampling that hasn't been done yet? Or is there something that isn't used as much, or a different approach that you don't see people using that may be smart or something to keep in mind?
You know, it's always evolving. You know, it's even like when we talk about how the deal structures are now and what the deal structures were in 1990 when we first started, you know, when we used to do buyouts. And then I was telling someone, then we used to do rollovers, and it was penny rates, and it was a percentage of PPD. It's always changing. So I think when you get these new young producers in, they're always trying to come up with new stuff. And I think because they've got YouTube and Spotify, digging through the crates is a very different way than what we used to do in the 90s, which was going to a record store. You know, I lived in New York City, where I don't know how much vinyl I bought off the streets that people used to sell, you know, on St. Mark's and on, you know, I'm aging myself here.
It's still there.
But that's how we used to get all of our vinyl. So I think because people have the ability, and I think there's a lot more foreign stuff that gets sampled. Remember, everyone was going through that Bollywood stage, and then thank God the royalty network started licensing and representing Sarigami, making things go a lot faster and easier. Then people were going for a lot of this stuff out of different African countries, like a Nigerian beat, or Ghana, or, you know, South Africa's got a huge growing market of music. So it's people are going for different sounds, and YouTube is offering it to these kids who are digging through those crates. I think, though, what's happening now, which is harder for me, which is what I just went through with Megan Thee Stallion, which is her producer sampled a song that had 3 samples in it, one of which also had 2 samples in it, which led to 23 writers and 14 publishers. But we made it happen, and we did it. So you're going to always see changes because you're having different generations of kids doing things. And so they're always listening to things stuff. And then they're also trying to do what people used to do, the way Puff used to sample. Remember how Puff used to just take the whole thing?
Yeah.
take the big chunk of that musical part and then rap on top and turn it into a hit.
Yeah.
So, but then you listen to, Drake, where he sometimes just takes little pieces of things. Look at what Kendrick did on Pimp a Butterfly, where we had all these different little pieces, had all these different producers to create these beautiful pieces of work. So everyone has their own style and technique. And maybe that's why I love sampling so much. I think it's like being a chef. You are taking all these different ingredients and creating something new. And if you don't consider that music, well, that's fine. That's your opinion, but it is music and it's here to stay. And people who used to say, well, they need to learn how to play an instrument and not sample. You know what? It is an art. It is a skill to be able to take something, change that tempo, change that sound, and make it sound like it was supposed to be in that song. So I know I could get but I love it. I just absolutely love it.
It's amazing. Well, it shows. I mean, you constantly, it's not just me. It's like, I don't know. I think I saw DJ Khaled shouting you out. It's like everywhere somebody's got a release. It's like, people have come through you. And I think that's really appropriate. And I hope that you feel that appreciation, not just from music supervisors, but from the industry in general.
Yeah. The other thing worth noting too, what Deborah's saying is that this is an art form. Appropriation art is an art form. And if you look at the world's richest visual artists, look at Jeff Koons is worth $500 million and he's doing the same thing, but in a visual format, right? And so we're really talking about collage. And the other thing worth noting is that, throughout history, artists, they reflect their natural environment, and our natural environment now is media. We're not looking at water lilies, Manet or whatever. We're really looking at media. So these are the things that our palette consists of. And, I think appropriating music and media and spoken word, like Drake did, all of these things kind of create that collage, which sampling really is a fundamental part of. I mean, there's advertising stickers on fruit. We are bombarded with media, so why not put that back into the world? And the reality is that music has been doing this forever. Bela Bartok is a classical composer. He interpolated Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in his music. There's all kinds of, this has been happening forever. Bach did it, Mozart did it. So it's nothing new, but I think that it was kind of criminalized, or, at least there was a racial component in the court that we need to acknowledge, that the courts, really came down on this, and it really kind of blunted creativity for a while. So now
it still exists, though. That's a great point. I don't sometimes try to go in that direction on these panels, but I've been on a soapbox about that a lot. That it is a racial situation, because I can listen to a song and I'll be like, that's just like the Violent Femmes guitar line. I'll reach out to Sony ATV. I'm like, oh, was that cleared? Oh, no, we don't consider it that. So, but as soon as it comes to this genre of music, hip hop and rap, it is theft. It is, all these negative connotations, and it's not going to last, and it's this and it's that. No, we're still not even really shown that much at the music awards. Remember, they didn't even show any performances, or those awards. They were scared about, what profanity that the artist would use, but then you'd have Guns N' Roses using profanity. So, we're not there yet, Adam. You're right, though. And the other thing I want to kind of bounce off of is using other things, and kind of what Barry said. Besides music, if you look at Marshall's last album, we used a lot of Alfred Hitchcock, which was really exciting to do. And then Logic used Orson Welles. So there is that new creativity. People have taken from films before. It's very expensive. You're dealing with unions. You also need to, get the rights from the likeness of the person's voice. But that was a neat direction what these two guys did in 2020.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. I mean, and that's exactly those new frontiers. That's really cool. I don't want to go too long, just so appreciative of all of your time. I do want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. We have a couple of things that have popped up from the Q&A. I'll try and go through them in order. I have one here that says, how do splits get figured out for remixes and samples? One thing that I'll say towards this is, in my kind of limited experience in terms of samples, when I have experienced a producer who's laying a heavy sample into a track, I'll say, great, finish your track, and then redo it without the sample and register that version as your version. That's the version that you've written. That's the version that you own and you can control. And then if you want to put the sample back on it, license it as a remix. But at that point, the sample isn't the foundation of your track. And the reason I do that as a music supervisor is because if you've just sampled Biggie Smalls in your track, then that means if I want to license your song for a film, I not only have to license from you, but I also have to license from the Wallace estate. And that's an extra step that may preclude the producer from getting more syncs.
Don't forget, though, if you're going to do that remix, you have to give it a different title to differentiate it for publishing, writers, and splits and stuff like that. Also, you know, back in the day when people did that, Bridgeport would go after both versions of the song. So just be really careful and make sure that it's titled differently, that it's almost like two very different songs, and be careful with the word remix when you do something like that, because they'll go after that.
So what you're actually saying is you're not going to keep the title of the song the same and call it a remix of the song you sampled. If you created an original song out of it and it's like, hey, I made track 32, I can put out a track 32 remix and license a sample for that, whereas the original track 32 doesn't have a sample. But what you're saying is that companies are kind of, you know, their guards are up. So if they see a remix and they hear a sample in it, they may very well go back to the original and try and find out whether or not they're parts of that original, you know, their sample and the original as well. Okay. And just for the question, how do splits get figured out? You said that on the master side, the recording will be received by the rights owner or the record label, and there will be a process by which they listen and put forth how much of the track percentage-wise they believe their sample comprises of. And on the publishing side, it's kind of the same way. You go to a publisher instead of a label, they listen to the track, and then you have a talk in terms of what percentage of the original song is comprised of by the sample. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, but with the split situation, you know, like Adam will say, Deborah, we cleared the sample and the value is 20%. I need the writers and publishers for the other 80%. Back in the day, it was a lot different. You know, when I worked with LL Cool J, and it's funny, I spoke to him recently, reminded him when we did 14 Shots to the Dome, it was a 70-30 split. He got 70, the producer got 30, and the sample came out of that 30. And he's just like, how do you remember that? I'm like, I don't know my son's phone number, but I know the splits. But now a lot of times it comes off the top. You know, Marshall does that, Drake does, most of these guys do that, where it's like a 50-50, the producer has 50, the artist, you know, has 50, and then if the sample takes 20, it gets reduced on both sides. Unfortunately, like for Adam, he sometimes has to wait several months for us to get these splits because the lawyers are still battling it out with the contracts. So we try to work as fast as we can to at least say, well, Adam, the sample quote has been approved. We agree to that. My client agrees to that 20%. We might say, here are the writers and publishers. We don't have percentages, but at least he can do something to try to protect himself as fast as he can.
Good advice. We have another question. It says, hello, panelists, from Cher Shembri. Hello, panelists. Thank you for your wisdom. I'm fairly new to clearing samples. I have no way of knowing if a drum track used by an artist is a sample or not. So are there tools that can help detect samples of what a sample is or who it belongs to? And anyone?
I'm not aware of anything, but I was going to ask Cheapshot, is there something out there to help identify samples like that besides our human ears?
I mean, the drum ones I feel bad for some of the old drummers, because I think a lot of those, even on Splice, you can get the old Clyde Stubblefield breaks, you know, stuff like that. Those have been passed around in the industry, and I think have just become almost public domain at this point, which is super sad. I mean, but I don't know. I mean, we certainly don't use those. But you know, there's a great website. I mean, it's great in some aspects. It's horrible sometimes on the artist side, but the whosampled.com, where you can go to any track from yesteryear and it's user aggregated, I guess, and you can find out who's used what and what point of the clip it's used, and yeah. So I mean, you could find a lot there.
Yeah, I think the best tools are ears, like Deborah, or on the last panel, it's like Shadow, Paz, or Justin. It's like they'll be able to identify just about any kick drum, any snare drum, tell you where it's from. But to my knowledge, there isn't a software suite that can actually do that at the moment. Next question, on location, Memphis, a percentage of what? What is PPD? Not sure what Deborah said. I think it was referring back to when you're establishing the splits and what the royalty is going to be. Is it based on PPD, which stands for?
Adam, why don't you also jump in on this one, because you're the one who usually is on the label side negotiating this stuff, but it's price per dealership. But go ahead, Adam.
So yeah, basically you get mechanical royalties as a publisher for sales of music, and you get PPD if you're a master, or if you own a piece of the master. You're basically getting a percentage of sales. And so when we negotiate ancillary revenue, we're looking at that. We're looking of a percentage of sync generated by the master owner. So while we don't have an ownership interest per se in the master itself, we do participate in revenue generated for the master. And for us, since we own everything one stop, it's usually commensurate with whatever we negotiate on the publishing side. So if we get 20% on the publishing, more likely than not that we're going to ask for 20% on revenue generated on the master side. But PPD is subject to its own way smaller percentage, because we're basically asking for a little piece of the sales, and sometimes if it's a single, you would get more. If it's as an album, sort of a more prorated share. So it's really you're participating in what's generated by sale.
What's generated by sale. Great. And I think we're close to up on time. I wanted to key into one of the questions that was, how do you clear a sample for a song that's international, obscure, from a place where there is no PRO or any regulated structures in order to get revenue to artists? Is that something that any of you have encountered?
I mean, you have to remember, when it comes to the world of publishing, everyone has, a sub-publisher, but let's say they don't. We actually just cleared something out of Russia for a podcast. So we, at DMG, we use any means necessary to hunt someone down and find them. And because it's the internet, and because there's Google Translator, we have reached out to the far ends of the earth. We deal with Japan a lot. We deal with Asia, again, India. A lot of the stuff is through royalty network. So even if something is international, they might have something with the PRS. I mean, we use all the sites imaginable, and we use Facebook, and we use Twitter, and we use Instagram, and we use everything we can to try to find that person. And if they're dead, we look for the estate. So our clients, like Cole, do not take no for an answer. We have to find these people.
So the answer is there's no, well, I looked, they didn't get back to us, so I guess you're okay to go ahead and do it. So the answer is, do not short yourself on overturning stones. Turn the stones over. That music came from someone, and there's someone connected to that song that is looking and waiting for your phone call. Wow, I can't thank you all enough. This has been really amazing in terms of just being able to talk about sampling in general. I know that it's not always the happiest topic, but I think that you have opened us up to find where the peace is in clearing samples. Deborah and Cheapshot, you've made us all very confident that if you are lacking 90s hip hop that you can't afford, that's period, there are still ways and producers and artists that you can work with to be able to create authentic sounding music that will still fit the scene. And Adam, you have been great in being able to demonstrate what the possibilities are with something that people would call canned music, or it's just, production music. It's like, what are we going to do with that? But you just basically showed us 7 or 8 bangers that were made straight from the catalog. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Anything else that you all would like to say to the folks before we break for the morning session?
I've put my email address in there because I know a lot of times people have questions about budgets. What are my fees? Which is all on my website. But we have a policy at DMG. We respond to every email up to at least 24 hours. We definitely get back to you, and we can answer some of these questions we didn't have time to. Keep on sampling and keep on being nice to one another during these difficult times, and have a great day.
I also want to mention, absolutely keep on sampling our catalog, and throw all of your support to the Guild of Music Supervisors. APM was the founding sponsor of the Guild, and we love the Guild. We love the Guild's members, and please show them love and support them as much as you can. It's an incredible organization.
Any parting words, Cheapshot?
GMS. Woo.